So, I originally wasn't planning on covering the whole Jubilee Jordan Peterson thing, especially after some more news did a very good breakdown of the video in question. However, I remembered two facts. I hate Surrounded, and I really don't like Jordan Peterson. And although I've already discussed why I dislike his theological views in a blog post I wrote back in June of this year, I figured it might also be smart to do a more Jordan Peterson-centric version of that, except on YouTube as opposed to on Medium. Now, because a commentary on this specific video would almost certainly devolve into me talking about why I don't like the people involved, I've decided to split this commentary into two parts. The first of these is going to be on Jordan Peterson's religious worldview and why it doesn't really make any sense, and the second is going to be a criticism of the Surrounded series, although both will be, at least in theory, commentaries on the same video. Although, fair warning, this will be one of the commentaries where I do a lot of digression and don't strictly talk about the video I plan on responding to. Basically, they're jumping off points to discuss topics that are incredibly related to the video in question, but the scope of them go well beyond said video. You see, this video is a fucking mess, and one of the main reasons for why that is comes down to Peterson's own theological views, which are, and I mean this in the most direct way possible, utter nonsense. Coming from somebody who's watched his fair share of Peterson for the past decade he's been in the public light, the best way I can summarize his viewpoint is that he doesn't really concern himself with if biblical stories are literally true, and instead puts more focus on the metaphorical or spiritual truths he believes they convey. Now, that's a position Peterson is allowed to hold. I wish to be totally clear about that. However, it also leads to some very weird statements about religion from him. Take this comment, for example.
Fairy tale or reality?
Oh no, it's why or? Fairy tale and reality. Right? There's no or there. So the deepest fairy tales are the most real. That's for sure. Yeah, we don't understand fiction. We don't understand what fiction means. Fiction is a form of distillation. And I suppose at times the fictional and the real unite. And that's the essence of the Christian claim, I would say. That's the right way of thinking about it. That's a way of thinking about it. There's many ways of thinking about complex things.
But the problem with that claim is something cannot be both fiction and reality, because that doesn't even make any sense. If something is fictional, it, by definition, is not happening in the real world. To put it another way, something can't be both fairy tale and reality, because that doesn't make any fucking sense. Now, Peterson may believe these are fairy tales which convey a truth about reality, but there's already a term for that. It's called fiction. And I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with taking lessons from fairy tales, or taking lessons from fiction in general, or believing that it conveys something true about the world. That is perfectly fine. However, that's not the same thing as saying this event actually happened. For reference, fables are similarly stories which convey a truth about reality.
Some examples of a fable you might have heard are The Tortoise and the Hare, Humpty Dumpty, Pacific Rim, and the autobiography of Hillary Clinton. This one's a fable because the main character's a bitch. I'm just kidding. Humpty Dumpty's not a fable.
However, if I ask somebody if fables are fairy tales or reality, and reality here means did they actually happen, they'll almost certainly tell me they are, in fact, fairy tales. You can believe The Tortoise and the Hare had a good message, while at the same time not believing there actually was a race between a tortoise and a hare. Although, maybe I speak too soon, given this was the man who said that he did believe dragons existed. For those who don't know, I'm referring to an article from the New York Times in 2018, which quoted Peterson as saying, Yeah, they do. They do exist. They just don't exist the way you think they exist. They certainly exist. You may well say dragons don't exist. It's like, yes, they do. The category predator and the category dragon are the same category. It absolutely exists. It's a superordinate category. It exists absolutely more than anything else. In fact, it really exists. What exists is not obvious. You say, well, there's no such thing as witches. Yeah, I know what you mean, but that isn't what you think when you go see a movie about them. You can't help but fall into these categories. There's no escape from them. Apologies if this is a moronic question, but how exactly are dragon and predator the same category when there are various pieces of media where dragons are not represented as predators? Hell, in Chinese mythology, dragons have historically been represented as lucky and ethereal as opposed to dangerous like they are in English mythology. This is the same article, by the way, where Peterson got in trouble for saying we should have enforced monogamy in response to a situation where a man killed 10 people while also being an incel. Here is what Peterson said. He was angry at God because women were rejecting him, Mr. Peterson says of the Toronto killer. The cure for that is enforced monogamy. That's actually why monogamy emerges. Even ignoring the ethics of that statement, it's just factually incorrect. There's not actually an agreement among scientists on why humans became monogamous, or even when it actually ended up happening. So Peterson pretending to have any sort of insight on this topic is just him assuming things. None of this is even getting into how the connection was, for lack of a better term, completely imagined by Peterson anyway. Does Peterson have any evidence that the concept of monogamy had any relationship to this person being radicalized by incel forums? I understand the wider sociological point Peterson is attempting to make here, don't get me wrong, albeit I disagree with it primarily because, again, no connection can really be established in any meaningful sense. Now, after Peterson got backlash because people assumed he meant essentially forcing women to marry men, he said the following while talking to Dave Rubin.
Well, we could start by what I don't mean. I don't mean taking innocent women at gunpoint and handing them over to useless men, which is essentially the accusation. You know, and it was really interesting to watch that unfold. What I meant was that monogamy as something that's socially valued appears to be essentially a human universal. That doesn't mean that human beings are universally monogamous, because obviously we're not. We can be serially monogamous, and some people are players and have multiple partners and all of that. But there's a strong proclivity across known societies to tilt towards monogamy. And the enforcement is social norms. It's like, think about it. I can't believe that I even have to say this.
First off, only 17% of human cultures have been strictly monogamous throughout history, with the vast majority of human societies allowing some form of polygamy, albeit most relationships in said civilizations are monogamous. It also needs to be acknowledged that the jumping off point for Peterson saying all of this was an event that happened in Canada, a country which has outlawed polygamy on the federal level since 1890, and where laws against polygamy are getting more enforced than they previously were, especially following a 2011 ruling from British Columbia's Supreme Court, which determined once and for all that religious freedom was not a justification for violating said laws. A notion that, up until that point, had made Canadian authorities very hesitant to enforce these pieces of legislation. Even if you just open this up to polyamory and not specifically polygamy, as both terms are commonly understood, a study from the same year Jordan Peterson had that New York Times interview found that only 4% of Canadians considered themselves polyamorous, Meanwhile, only 36% said they supported the decriminalization of such relationships, and 25% said they supported the legalization. Peterson wants to paint a picture of a civilization that is perfectly fine with non-monogamy. However, the actual data from that time simply doesn't back up what he's saying. This topic of conversation comes up in Jordan Peterson's interview with Alex O'Connor, and there are a couple of clips here when talking about Jesus that I think really show Peterson's misunderstanding of several different concepts. Let's go through them real quick.
I think it's in the Gospel of John. I think Gospel of John closes with a statement that's something like, if all the books that were ever written were written about the Gospel accounts, that wouldn't be enough books to explain what had happened.
Yeah, if all the things that Jesus did.
Yeah. And it's there's a truth in that. The truth is that profound religious account is bottomless.
Peterson just badly mangles the quote from John here. What it actually says is, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. The point is not that what had happened was so complex it would take an infinite amount of books to properly describe it, but instead what this one person had done is so much that it would take an infinite amount of books to list every single action. Also, John 21 is largely viewed as a later addition to the New Testament, and not something originally written by the author of said gospel. Just saying. Also, the verse is almost certainly meant to be hyperbolic from a literary standpoint. I don't think even the abnormally spiritualist nature of John was meant to lead one to the conclusion that Jesus did infinite things, and as such, it would take an infinite amount of books to write them all down. Oh, this verse is also a contradiction of Acts 1 verses 1 through 2, by the way, which said specifically the Gospel of Luke contained everything Jesus did. Just figured I'd also point that out real quick.
The thing about the resurrection accounts is that they're all... Look, so I could say something like this, which will just annoy people, but it doesn't matter. I believe the accounts, but I have no idea what they mean.
When you say you believe the accounts, do you mean, and I hate to be sort of pedantic here, it seems pedantic, but do you mean you believe that these are things that happened such that that's a strange
I
know you don't
state.
Like that. Let me put it this way. If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
So that to me seems like a belief in the historical event of the resurrection, or at least of Jesus leaving the tomb, which means that when somebody says, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? It doesn't seem clear to me why you're not able to just say, it would seem to me yes.
Because I have no idea what that means. And neither did the people who saw it.
I find O'Connor's example particularly interesting because in it is physically observing the event in question. He is discussing using technology to actually film the event as it takes place. And Peterson doesn't understand the question, but does understand what it would mean for that event to show up on the LCD screen of a Panasonic video camera. I also want to point out that Peterson's idea that these accounts are true, but he doesn't understand what they mean, is just contradictory. In order for you to declare something true or false, you have to have an understanding of what is being stated in the first place, so you can respond to it accordingly. If somebody tells me something in a language I don't understand, it would make no sense for me to declare that statement true without at least translating it into a language I do understand. Because otherwise, what the fuck am I even saying is true? I have no idea. Or does Peterson reenact that one scene from Blazing Saddles anytime he reads the resurrection accounts?
Hell, I was born here, and I was raised here, and dadgummit, I'm gonna die here. And no, Saturday behind him bushwhacking, hornswoggling, crocker is gonna roll away biscuit cutter.
Now, who can argue with that?
Look, let's approach this obliquely, let's say.
Yeah.
The miracle of the loaves and the fishes.
Yeah.
Okay, so people will say, well, do you believe that happened literally, historically? It's like, well, yes, I believe that. It's okay. Okay, what do you mean by that? That you believed that? Exactly.
Yeah.
So you tell me, you're there in the way that you described.
Right.
And
What do you
what
see?
are the fish
What do you
doing
see? Yeah.
exactly? And the answer is you
Yes.
don't know. You have no notion about it at all. You have no theory about it.
Sure.
So your belief is, what's your belief exactly?
But there's a difference between believing something happened and not knowing the details versus not knowing what's being communicated at all. If a mechanic fixes a person's car, for example, that person might not understand exactly how the mechanic did it, but they will understand their car was broken and now it's fixed. And that's more along the lines of what Peterson is talking about here versus the resurrection, where he just said he didn't understand what was even being discussed in the first place. Does Peterson mean that he believes a resurrection happened but doesn't know what it means for somebody to die and come back to life? If so, what is tripping him up about that exactly? Again, this sounds like a bunch of nonsense. I also want to point out there's a massive difference in proportionality here that makes this a false comparison. Not just in terms of what Peterson doesn't understand in these situations, but also in terms of what is even being talked about. The entire basis of Christianity is that a man named Jesus lived 2,000 years ago and rose from the dead. That is fundamental to the very idea of it. With 1 Corinthians even saying, "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead, but he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied." No similar requirement is present for the miracle Peterson talks about in that clip, so all around, this just fails to make any sense.
Clearly, I mean, you spent more time in Exodus than probably any person I've ever met in person, right? Clearly the story sort of captivates you and you think it's really important and can teach us a lot, right?
Yeah,
of course.
It's infinitely deep story.
I think most people speaking to you already know that you think that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when they ask you a question, when they suddenly say to you, but do you think it really happened?
Well, what the hell does that mean?
You must know that what they mean is what I was talking about a second ago, which is that sort of...
What? Okay, so fine. So it's easy just to turn this around. It's like, okay, what exactly happened in your historical account when Moses encountered the burning bush?
I don't need to know exactly what happened. What I need to know is
I'm not asking you specifically
I know.
Or attacking you for that.
What I need to know is that if...
Again, Peterson is confusing a smaller detail within the story with the overall historical account. And again, I just don't know where the confusion keeps arising from regarding the question of, did this happen? And again, I need to stress this just to make it really clear. I am an atheist. If Jordan Peterson just said he doesn't believe these stories happened, but does think they communicate messages that are worth exploring and teach us great truths, albeit not in a literal learning history sense, I'm not going to sit here and say I'd 100% agree with him, but at the very least, I'd agree with that more than what he's currently saying. Do you know who actually would agree with that message, though? A lot of Jews. The blogger Tim Zeke, writing on Medium, noted of 2 rabbis along with 1 convert to Judaism who all believed the Exodus story was fictional. Rabbi David Walp, Sinai Temple's senior rabbi, interviewed by the Los Angeles Times, said, quote, "The truth is that virtually every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all." Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman, the distinguished professor of liturgy at Hebrew Union College, in his article titled "The Bible is Fiction," did not discuss history or archaeology, but argued more broadly that the books of Moses are fiction because their authors meant it not as science or history, but as presentation. William Deaver, a convert to Judaism and a professor of Near Eastern archaeology and anthropology at the University of Arizona, and one of America's preeminent archaeologists, argued that, quote, "The Exodus story was produced for theological reasons, to give an origin and history to a people and distinguish them from others by claiming a divine destiny." Jordan doesn't even like the question of if he believes in God or not. Here's him talking about that in an interview from 2017.
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God.
What do you mean by you don't know what the person means? I don't know what you mean by that. Those words have definitions, don't they? Can't you refer back to that and then answer the question based off of said definitions? I'm really confused right now. Also, yeah, it is trying to box you into this binary choice because there are only 2 options. Do you personally believe in a God? Yes or no? It should also be a rather easy question to answer for somebody who's directly said he doesn't believe it's so much as possible for somebody to not believe in God. Here's him saying that to Matt Dillahunty.
You know, while I pretend to read minds on stage, I constantly acknowledge that I can't actually read minds. So I can't tell you whether or not she actually believes in a God, but I can tell you that I actually don't believe in a God, and I could write poetry.
But you act like you do.
Huh?
But you act like you do. That's why you didn't want to throw poor Sam off the stage.
No, now you're making a claim. Okay, so I'm telling you I don't believe there's a God, and your response to that is, I really do, because I have a moral sense. But my moral sense is utterly without any appeal to a God.
Explicitly.
Or implicitly.
Maybe. That's not so obvious.
Okay, it's really
because
it's
you regard Sam Harris as an implicitly valuable entity, because otherwise you just throw him off the stage. And then the question is, well, just exactly why is he an implicitly valuable entity? What's your metaphysics of that?
I don't think he's implicitly valuable in the sense,
So for someone like Jordan, shouldn't the answer to the question, do you believe in God, just be yes? I also need to note, by the way, this whole conversation started because of this interaction.
For years, I had this thing going where people would say, oh, and this is kind of what we're getting at from a different angle. I would say they would be afraid of what we would lose if we lost religion. And I basically said, demonstrate to me any benefit.
Oh, you'd lose art and poetry and drama and narrative and story.
Are there no godless artists and poets?
Well, there are artists and poets who think they're godless.
Jordan Peterson has been collecting art from the Soviet Union since 2000. The Soviet Union famously persecuted those who believed in a higher power, meaning evidence that atheists can be artists is present in Jordan Peterson's own fucking collection. This is the same debate where Peterson declared that he was unsure how anybody could stop smoking without supernatural intervention.
We have no way of confirming that this something mystical or supernatural actually happened. What this is about the language.
Stops people from smoking.
Well, you can stop smoking without any sort of supernatural intervention.
No, not really.
You can't stop smoking without supernatural?
There aren't really any reliable chemical means for inducing smoking cessation.
By the way, after that debate, Jordan Peterson has refused to debate Matt Dillahunty ever since.
Is it true that Jordan Peterson won't debate you anymore?
Well, it seems to be true. Basically, while we were finishing up on stage, he said he'd be happy to have another conversation with me. And then the second the debate was over, he bolted off the stage, went and locked himself in his dressing room. And what I was told is that his manager, publicist, whoever, basically said, you should never do another event with that guy. And so I haven't heard anything from Jordan Peterson since that night.
Peterson's objection to atheism isn't even that he thinks it's wrong, more that he thinks it doesn't exist. Here's him talking about it.
What do you think the best argument for atheism is?
I don't think there is a good argument for atheism. I think it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the world. So it's just, it's what would you say? It's an illegal chess move.
Okay. Well,
it's based on the wrong...
What does Peterson mean by an illegal chess move? He says it's based off of a misunderstanding of reality, but there can still be arguments for misunderstandings of reality that are better than other arguments. Peterson isn't so much a theist as we'd think of him as he is an anti-atheist. Or possibly even an atheist denialist. I think the reason he believes he's not an atheist is because he's not sure atheists exist. Peterson has also said things like that you cannot prove anything exists without personally believing in a higher power. This confusion made him debating 20 atheists a really bad idea, by the way. Now, Peterson makes 4 claims he wants those around him to debate with him. Let's go through them real quick, and I think it will soon become obvious what I mean.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science. My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it. My final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories.
Notice how none of those claims have anything to do with what should be the actual question being discussed. Is theism correct? I could concede to every single thing Peterson says here and still be an atheist. That is how unrelated the topics even are. Hell, the 4th claim here is something I've seen atheists directly say, albeit I wouldn't agree with that because I find the concept of Christian morality a little too vague to be useful, but there are atheists who bring up the idea of the average non-religious person being better at following the morality of Jesus than the average Christian.
Jesus as a philosopher is wonderful. There's no greater role model, in my view, than Jesus Christ. It's just a shame that most of the people who follow him and call themselves Christians act nothing like him.
Most of them? Most Christians are
in this country.
Bad?
So it turns out the religious right are actually massive hypocrites, and they're deeply immoral. And you already knew that, so I don't even know why I bothered with that being the intro. So here, take a look at this this graphic. This is from Pew Research Center. It's interesting because what you have here is the religiously unaffiliated are actually the most in line with the philosophy of their religion. So these are all Christians, different kinds of Christians, but Christians nonetheless. And it really is the religiously unaffiliated, the atheists and agnostics, who more embody the message of their religion than they do. And that's what the numbers show. That's not my opinion. That's what the numbers show. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, listen, we could give any of a number of quotes from the Bible on this issue, but I'll just give you a few. Deuteronomy 10:19, you shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Leviticus 27:19, cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Then all the people shall say, Amen. Psalm 146:9, seems like a high number. The Lord watches over the strangers. He upholds the orphan and the widow, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin. And here, I'll just give you two more. Matthew 25:35, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Matthew 25:40, truly I say to you, as you did to one of the least of my brethren, you did to me. My whole thing on this is, and perhaps this isn't surprising, this is a pretty banal take, but if you want to be conservative on that issue of immigration, okay, then be conservative on that issue of immigration, but just know you got to pick one or the other. In other words, it's either your Christianity or your conservatism on immigration. You got to pick one or the other. Because this is one of those issues you can't have your cake and eat it too. Your religion is crystal clear. It takes the lefty position, the open-hearted and tolerant position on immigrants and refugees. So either remain a Christian, but don't be a dick to immigrants and refugees, or don't be a Christian and then be a dick. Either one.
And for reference on just how far back this notion has existed among atheists, C.S. Lewis created his famous trilemma about Jesus either being a lunatic, a liar, or the Lord, based off of this very notion. I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. But what does Peterson even mean by Christian morality? Well, lucky for us, somebody asks him that.
My question to you, let me scoot in, would be, what does it mean to accept Christian values precisely, or Christian morality?
It means to aim up as hard as you can, no matter what happens to you.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think that that's a very broad definition of what Christian morality is.
Yeah, but it'll come in handy at some point in your life.
Right. But I think that many different disciplines and theologies.
Well, you asked for a truncated answer. Eh?
Right.
I mean, there's other ways of representing the situation, but I wanted to give you something that was kind of foundational briefly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It doesn't mean it's, exhaustive.
Yeah.
I could say that you would have to believe that Christ is God and he died for your sins, right? But that's in a very difficult way to understand. That's the same claim.
But I thought they agreed with the morality while rejecting the fundamental stories. If the story is also the same claim as the morality, then you can't separate those two things like Peterson did originally. But that's not even the only Peterson claim that is needlessly confusing. Here's Jordan Peterson being asked a hypothetical by one of his debate opponents.
Would you lie to save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
Can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
I'll give you an example. If you're in Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them,
example.
would you lie to the Nazis?
I would have done everything I bloody well could, so I wouldn't be in that situation to begin with. It's a hypothetical, and it's
You
not
can't answer
answerable.
hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like
What?
that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look,
Did you eat
don't
today?
play games.
I'm not playing a game. I'm just
Yes,
asking if
you
you ate
are.
it.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I just told you I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation. By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care about, like there could be a Jewish friend that you have and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them
give
in your
up on
attic.
that line of question.
This continues on until Peterson literally runs out the clock regarding how long they have to discuss this topic. Peterson's answer is essentially that when you're in such a situation, you've already fucked up so badly that nothing you do is going to be moral. Of course, there's still a least immoral option in this situation unless you believe that every decision you could make would be of equal moral worth, which Peterson also doesn't say. And also, I could sit here and pick apart the whole he'd do everything possible to avoid ending up in that situation thing, and don't get me wrong, that is utterly nonsensical. Instead, I just want to emphasize how nonsensical it is to say this came about because of a series of bad decisions specifically. Who's to say that's inherently going to be the case? Especially given all we know about this hypothetical person is that they live in Nazi Germany and are trying to shelter Jews in their attic. We don't know why they're living in Nazi Germany. It could be because they were just born in Germany and are unable to leave. We don't know if they're a Nazi or agree with the policies of the Nazis, and if anything, they seem to have at least some disagreement with Nazi anti-Semitism if they're willing to do this. Hell, what if the person was previously a Nazi, however they changed their mind and are trying to make up for their previous bad action by saving some people from Nazi oppression to the best of their ability? I can think of several different situations where doing exactly the thing Peterson dismissed would be not just moral, but I'd argue, incredible. And by the way, it's not even as if this is some far-off time period that Jordan Peterson just can't possibly relate to. Hitler became Chancellor of Nazi Germany on January 30th, 1933. Not even a full century ago at time of recording. And 28,000 Jewish people in the Netherlands alone were in hiding in some way during the time Nazis occupied said nation. I also want to add, while on this topic, it's not as if Peterson is against simplistic comparisons to the Nazis. Anybody remember this clip after he was suspended from Twitter for dead-naming Elliot Page while saying the surgeon who performed his top surgery was also a criminal, even though that's not what that word means?
And finally, with regard to the final phrase, criminal physician, I must say that I've had some post-coital, so to speak, regrets about that phrase. It is clearly the case that the surgical operation performed by the butchers who butchered Elliot/Ellen was legal. So, was it criminal or not? Were the operations undertaken by the fascist physicians who carried out the Nazi medical experiments legal? Yes, under the laws of the time. But were they criminal? I'll leave that question up to you to answer.
Given the Nazi government persecuted transgender people, this comparison made very little sense, in all honesty. This is that video that became a meme a few years back because of Peterson's declaration.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Which was seen as needlessly overdramatic given the situation in question.
So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery is wrong, I think
No,
it should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
No, that was because God told him to do such because they were his chosen people. Non-Stamp Collector documented in his satirical video on the topic how the Bible then went on to say slavery was perfectly okay, assuming you were an Israelite who was enslaving somebody from outside that tribe.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave? Isn't that immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species, as he said earlier about empathy?
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God.
The entire concept of there being a united Judeo-Christian morality would have been totally alien to Christians of that era, though. I'll link an article that goes further into this in the notes for this commentary. However, the entire idea only started getting traction around the time of the Second World War, before exploding in popularity during the Cold War. Originally to signal a kinship that would explain why Christians should concern themselves with the anti-Semitic Nazi regime, although this later became a way to unite all theistic traditions in order to fight the state atheist Soviet Union. This can even be seen in things like a speech Dwight Eisenhower gave as president-elect in December of 1952, where he says, "In other words, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is."
Yeah, but the main thrust of Protestant thought in particular was stringently against slavery, and it was about the only movement in the history of the human race that had an anti-slavery direction.
Then why did Christian slaveholders use the Bible as justification for their practice of enslaving others? And why were so many of the local clergy opposed to Abraham Lincoln when he ran for president in 1860?
God came down and said, "Here is my moral code, and you should follow it. But even if you follow it, you are still going to end up in hell. Are you going to follow it?"
Well, that was the question that was put to Job and to Christ, right? Because they were required. Hang on, I'm answering your question. They were required to withstand trials that would break anyone and maintain their upward orientation regardless.
Okay, first off, those aren't even close to the same things. Jesus was undergoing suffering, according to Christian tradition, so that he could have all of humanity's sins placed on him, and so he could die and come back as evidence that he is the savior of humanity. Meanwhile, Job wasn't asked to undergo anything. It's not as if he had to sign a waiver beforehand. But even ignoring that minor slip-up, I'll admit, that wasn't him being forced to suffer for all of eternity despite being a good person. That was him losing what he had in life temporarily in order to show that he would still hold the same theological views regardless of what earthly benefits he had at that moment. That is all I have to say regarding Peterson's theology. However, join me next time where I discuss Jubilee and the Surrounded series and explain the other reason why this video is horrible. Because the whole series is horrible. Good night and good luck.